Hello Year 10, it's lovely to see you and to actually get to do the lesson that we planned to do with you before Christmas and then after the Christmas holiday, and now we get to do it for half term. So I'm going to show you today how to crumb coat your Victoria sandwich, and then we're going to have a go at flat icing the cake. So you must know I've not done this many times. Mrs. Halloran is the expert, and if you want a truly professional video, have a check out of YouTube as well to see how the pros do it. But we're just going to have a go, have some fun and see what happens. So here's one of the cakes that we made for you before Christmas. So I'm going to be using a square cake, and I expect most of you are using round cakes. The first thing that I'm going to do, or I have done, is to use a bread knife and just carefully cut across the top of the cake to get rid of this domed piece, and put that aside, eat that later, which gives me a flat surface. But I'm actually going to turn my cake over and use the really flat underside to become my top, so I'm working with the flattest side possible. And I'm also going to cut it in half, so you may well have already done this. So I've cut my cake in half, and then I'm going to put buttercream on one side, jam on the other, sandwich them back together before we crumb coat. So you can see I've taken the icing right up to the edges, because when I put the cake back together, I don't want there to be a sort of a ditch all the way round the middle of the cake where there's no icing or jam. So I'm now at the stage that you were asked to be at the beginning of the lesson, with my cake with jam and icing in it. Now we're going to crumb coat. So I expect you know the whole purpose in doing this is that it stops the crumbs from the cake coming through to the final layer of icing, and it also will help our white fondant icing to stick to the cake. So I've got my buttercream here. Mrs. Halloran talked to you about that, and making sure that you whisk it really well to get lots of air in it and make it nice and light and fluffy. And the trick with crumb coating is to have too much icing on to start with, so you're not trying to spread it too thinly. So if you just spread it all the way across the top of the cake, and that's way too thick at the moment, but it's easier to spread it when it's too thick. If your cake slides, just push it back together. There, now I'm going to get my knife, it's the only one to hand, to clear it off my palette knife again, and just come around the sides now. So I'm working on a board that I'm not going to be using in the end. You might have got your cake on your final board, but I thought I'd do this first because it doesn't matter what mess I get my board in. But if yours is on your final board, then you can clean it up later. So you can see we've got a thin layer on that edge. Then we just need to make sure we cover the cornery bit along there, like that. And then I'm going to work round by scraping some of the icing off of the top and putting it on the next side, making sure I do the corner. So as I said, I'm no expert. I'm just having a go, just like you are really. Remember that this layer is going to be covered up by your fondant, so it really doesn't have to be perfect. Don't be too precious about it. We're supposed to be having fun. So I'm now just working around and scraping off the excess. If you've got a really sweet tooth, you could leave it on a little bit thicker, but don't have too much on because it will make the fondant not sit well on the cake. It'll be too sort of bouncy. I'm going to scrape off a lot from the top there that I don't want. That's a bit Mrs. Halloran's tutting and thinking she could have done it much better, but we're giving her a little bit of time off. Okay, so I'm going to go with that. Now if you do this and you're not doing it in real time with us, you could leave that in the fridge again for a little while. Scrape the excess icing there. You could use that later on to make some little cupcakes perhaps, or another Victoria sandwich. Pop it in the fridge and it will last for a while. So there you've got the crumb coating on the cake. So before we put the white icing on, I'm going to move mine onto my proper cake board now. So I think Mrs. Halloran had asked you to have your cake ready on a board and I hadn't done it, so I'm not doing very well today. Naughty Mrs. Robinson. So I'm going to put a little bit of icing on the board to make my cake stick, and then I'm just running my palette knife underneath my cake. I'm going to lift it onto my board like that. So I've got a nice clean board. If your board's covered in bits of buttercream, like my chopping board, just give it a wipe round now with a damp cloth, so you've got a nice clean work surface. So I'm going to open my icing. So that will be the large block of icing that you have all been given. Some of you had it coloured up. And girls, I'm going to take my rings off, because you'll find they'll leave a dents and patterns. Boys, sorry, that was a very sexist comment. If you've got any rings on, take them off too. So now I'm just going to soften this up a little bit before I try and roll it. So you really have to get your weight behind it. Once it starts softening, it goes pretty quickly, like that. Try not to get too many creases in it, so don't sort of knead it and fold it over. And I'm going to put a little bit of corn flour or icing sugar, depending on what you've got. Mrs. Halloran advised corn flour was the best thing to use. So I'm going to have a go at that. I'd normally use icing sugar. Put my cake icing there. So I'm going for a square shape because it's going over a square cake. If you're going for a circular cake, you know, try and make it a bit more circular. I don't have to worry about that. So, same principle as rolling out pastry. A few rolls, turn it round, wiggle it, make sure there's a little bit of corn flour or icing sugar underneath it still. Try not to put too much pressure in one place and not in another, so we're keeping it even. Wiggle it, turn it, roll it. This is a nice long rolling pin, especially for doing icing, fondant icing like this. Wiggle, turn. So I'm just going to keep doing that until it's big enough to go over my cake. So I'm just going to check how big I need my icing to be. So my cake is 4 centimetres deep and 16 centimetres across. So that's 4 and 16 is 20, plus another 4 is 24. So it needs to be at least 24 centimetres around, so it's going to go over the cake. So I'm going to come back and check here now. So remember we said 24 centimetres. So that is about 30 by 30, so that's great. It gives me a little bit, 6 centimetres to play with. So just gently lift it around like that. You can see it's quite thick. I wouldn't normally put icing on quite that thick, but when you're a beginner, you get a better result if you have thick icing. So, rolling pin in the middle of the icing, fold the icing over the rolling pin, bring your cake, or take your icing to your cake because you're not trying to do it in front of your iPad. Then put the edge of that icing on the board like that, fold it over the cake, and you can see it's sitting quite nicely over the top. Reminds me a bit of a jellyfish. So now I'm going to use my hands. If you watch a YouTube video, they'll have a proper cake smoother, and I think our school one has gone to Claudia, so she'll be able to do hers properly. So just rub over the top to get a good seal with that butter icing, that buttercream that we're using, and then we're just going to start around the edges just to shape the icing down. So because I'm using a square, I'm going to have to shape it around the corners as well. With the round cake, you're going to take it round one edge, turn the cake, take it round, and you'll find you get little pleats that you need to lift up and just smooth down so the pleat ends up on the board. And I think Mrs. Halloran's going to send you a YouTube link to watch as well, which will show you better really for a round cake how to get rid of those pleats. So I'm really pleased with that. That's worked really well. Nice and smooth. I'm just using my little fingers here now just to tuck in on the bottom and on the corners, and then on the bottom here and on the corners, just to make sure I've got a good seal. like that. Use my hand just to smooth it off, like that. So I'm very pleased with that. I hope yours go well. And then the last thing to do is to cut away all the excess icing around the bottom. So you're going to bring your knife to the bottom of the cake. Don't go right in against it. Just go a little way away around the edge to start with, because you can always cut a little bit more off, but you can't really stick it back on. So I'd like to err on the side of caution. So I'm just going to come around the back as well. There, and just lift the extra icing away. And then you can just come around again now, just with your fingers very gently, and just ease that icing underneath the cake, like that. Smooth it round a bit. So to tidy up your cake board, you need to take a damp cloth, make sure it's a nice clean one, and just wipe around the board and get rid of any smears of icing sugar or buttercream that you've got, for a final touch like that. Now that's ready for decorating. I'm really looking forward to seeing yours and all the lovely decorations that you put on them at the end of the lesson. Good luck!